I'm sorry, but we can't process this withdrawal. Marissa Whitfield didn't even glance at the screen. She slid the account card back across the marble counter with 2 fingers like it had a smell. Our system shows this account doesn't match the customer standing in front of me. So unless you can explain that, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from my window. The woman on the other side of the counter, dressed in a charcoal blazer and simple flats, didn't move. She didn't argue, she didn't raise her voice. She just stood there perfectly still, holding a slim leather portfolio under her arm and watching Marissa with the kind of patience that should have made any reasonable person nervous. But Marissa wasn't nervous. Marissa was annoyed. "Ma'am, did you hear me? You need to step aside. There are other customers waiting." A man in the back of the line lifted his phone and started recording. Not to help, to watch. Another woman, 2 chairs deep into the waiting area, looked up from her magazine and then very deliberately looked back down. The branch manager, alerted by a small nod from Marissa's coworker, was already crossing the lobby with the unhurried stride of a man who had handled situations like this before and always come out on top. Nobody in that building knew it yet, but every single one of them was about to witness the most catastrophic professional collapse any of them had ever seen in person. And the woman they were about to humiliate was the one signing their paychecks starting Monday morning. To understand the full weight of what happened that Tuesday at Sterling National Bank, you need to understand who Adrienne Carter actually is. Not the woman Marissa Whitfield saw when she looked up from her screen. Not the assumption made in the space of half a second by someone who had decided, long before any words were exchanged, exactly what kind of person was standing in front of her. The real Adrienne Carter. The one whose name had been printed in the press release that went out at 6:00 a.m. that very morning. The one that Marissa hadn't bothered to read because she didn't read corporate emails before her second cup of coffee. The one whose photograph was already framed and waiting on the wall of the executive floor, 47 stories above the marble lobby, where she now stood being told she didn't belong. Adrienne Carter grew up in a row house on the east side of Baltimore. The kind of block where the sidewalks cracked in the summer heat and the streetlights flickered on and off for years before the city ever sent anyone to fix them. Her mother was a school nurse who worked 12-hour shifts and came home with stories about children who hadn't eaten that day. Her father had been a postal worker until a stroke at 51 took the use of his right side and most of his speech. Adrienne was 14 when that happened. She watched her mother carry the household on a single income for years afterward, watched her count coupons at the kitchen table on Sunday nights, watched her smile at her children and pretend everything was fine when Adrienne knew, even at 14, that nothing was fine. She made herself a promise in that kitchen, not the dramatic kind kids make and forget. The quiet kind, made in the corner of a room where nobody was looking, the kind that becomes the spine of every decision you make for the next 30 years. She was going to build something, not for herself, for the family that had given everything to keep her standing. She graduated valedictorian of a public high school where less than half her classmates would ever see a college campus. Full scholarship to Howard University. Then Columbia Business School. Then Goldman Sachs, where she spent 8 years outworking everyone around her and getting passed over for promotion 3 times by men with half her credentials and twice her confidence. She didn't complain. She didn't quit publicly. She just left quietly at 34 and started building something of her own. She called the firm Meridian Strategic Holdings. The name was deliberate. A meridian is a line of measurement, a reference point used to navigate, and Adrienne wanted every client who walked through her door to understand that her firm would be exactly that, a fixed point in an industry that shifted with the wind. She started with 3 employees, a leased office in Midtown Manhattan that smelled faintly of stale coffee, and a client list of exactly 2 companies that had taken a chance on her when nobody else would. She worked weekends. She missed birthdays. She slept on a futon in her office for the first 6 months because she couldn't afford both rent and operating costs, and she had decided very early that the business came first. Year 3 almost broke her. A major acquisition fell through at the last minute because a buyer got cold feet and pulled out 48 hours before signing. Adrienne lost 11 months of work and nearly $400,000 in committed expenses. She sat in her office that night with the lights off and the city humming through the window, and she did not cry. She made a list. Every mistake she had made, every assumption she had failed to challenge, every signal she had missed. Then she went asleep on the futon one more time and started over the next morning. By year 7, Meridian Strategic Holdings was managing acquisitions and consulting contracts worth over $600 million annually. By year 10, that number had crossed $2 billion. By the time she turned 47, Adrienne Carter was being named to every list that mattered in American finance: Forbes, Fortune, Black Enterprise. The Wall Street Journal ran a profile that called her one of the most quietly powerful executives in the country. But here's what nobody in the lobby of Sterling National Bank understood that Tuesday morning. The thing that made Marissa Whitfield's casual dismissal so catastrophically wrong. 3 weeks earlier, Meridian Strategic Holdings had finalized the acquisition of Sterling National Bank's parent company. A deal worth $1.4 billion, negotiated quietly over 14 months, closed without fanfare because Adrienne didn't believe in announcements that scared employees or shook stock prices unnecessarily. The press release had gone out that morning at 6:00 a.m. Eastern Time. Her name was on the third paragraph. Her photograph was on the company website by 7:30. And at 9:42 a.m. on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, Adrienne Carter had decided to walk into the flagship branch of the bank her firm now owned and make a personal withdrawal before her first official board meeting at noon. She didn't go in as the CEO. She didn't call ahead. She didn't bring an assistant or a security detail or even her usual driver. She drove herself in a dark blue sedan that she'd owned for 6 years and parked in a public garage 3 blocks away. She wore the same blazer she wore to most professional meetings, a simple white blouse underneath, dark trousers, low heels. She carried a leather portfolio under her arm that contained 2 forms of identification: a printed copy of her account statement from the night before and the signed acquisition agreement. The portfolio also contained, in a small interior pocket, a folded business card she hadn't used in years, the one that read simply, Adrienne Carter, founder and CEO, Meridian Strategic Holdings. She wasn't planning to use it. She didn't think she'd need to. She walked into Sterling National Bank's flagship branch on the corner of Madison and 52nd at 9:51. The lobby was exactly what 130 years of careful tradition was supposed to look like. Polished marble floors, brass railings, a coffered ceiling with hand-painted moldings, the faint smell of furniture polish and expensive cologne. 3 tellers were working. The line had 2 people ahead of her. She took her place quietly, portfolio under her arm, and waited her turn. She made eye contact with no one. She did not check her phone. She did not look around to be admired. She simply stood there, the way any customer would stand, waiting for a routine transaction on an unremarkable Tuesday morning. The man ahead of her was served in 3 minutes, the woman in front of him in 4. Then it was her turn. She stepped forward to window 2. Marissa Whitfield looked up, and the next 38 minutes would unravel her entire career. Marissa Whitfield was 34 years old and had been a teller at Sterling National Bank for 9 years. She had started at the branch in Queens, transferred to Brooklyn, then finally been promoted to the Madison Avenue flagship 2 years ago, a placement she considered the high point of her professional life. She wore her hair in a sleek bob that she had touched up at the salon every 3 weeks. She wore pearl earrings her grandmother had left her. She believed, in the quiet places where she didn't have to admit it out loud, that she was better at reading people than anyone else on the floor. She believed that 9 years behind a counter had given her an instinct, a kind of professional radar, for who belonged at Sterling National Bank and who didn't. She had told her coworkers more than once over the years that she could spot a problem customer the second they walked through the door. What she actually had was a habit. A pattern of small judgments made in the space of a second, dressed up in the language of professional intuition, applied with surgical consistency to a very specific set of customers. She had never been written up for it. She had never been formally accused of anything. The branch turnover at her window was slightly higher than average, but not enough to flag any system. Her supervisors liked her. Her annual reviews were strong. And so the pattern continued, year after year, transaction after transaction, each one too small to matter on its own and yet adding up slowly to something that would one day be impossible to hide. When Adrienne Carter stepped up to her window at 9:54 a.m. that Tuesday morning, Marissa's eyes moved across her in a familiar sequence. The blazer, off-the-rack quality. The portfolio, leather but not designer. No visible jewelry except a small silver watch. No subtle markers of the kind of wealth sterling national banks clientele typically displayed. Marissa made her assessment in less than 2 seconds. She decided, with the casual confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything that mattered, that the woman in front of her was almost certainly here to cash a check that wasn't hers, or to attempt some kind of identity theft, or at minimum to waste Marissa's time with a transaction that was going to require an excessive amount of verification. She decided this before Adrienne had said a single word. Adrienne placed her account card on the counter. Calm. Practiced. She had done this hundreds of times at various branches over the years. Good morning. I'd like to make a cash withdrawal, please. $12,000 from my personal account. Marissa picked up the card, held it at an angle, set it down. She didn't smile. She didn't say good morning back. She typed slowly into her keyboard, the kind of slow that wasn't about being careful. The teller at the next window finished a transaction in the time it took Marissa to type the account number. Adrienne watched it from the corner of her eye and said nothing. Marissa stopped typing, looked at the screen, frowned, looked at Adrienne, looked back at the screen. Then she did something that Adrienne had seen before in different cities at different counters with different employees behind them. She picked up the phone at her station and spoke in a low voice with one hand cupped over the receiver, set it down, and said with a tight, professional smile that contained no warmth at all, "I'm going to need you to step away from the window, ma'am. There's an issue with this transaction." Adrienne's voice stayed even. "What kind of issue? I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics. You'll need to wait. I'd prefer to resolve it here, please. I've held this account for 12 years. What exactly is the problem?" Marissa's smile didn't move. "Ma'am, please step aside. There are other customers waiting." Adrienne glanced behind her. The line had grown to 3 people, but none of them seemed in any particular hurry. One was scrolling his phone. Another was reading a newspaper. The third, an older woman in a tweed coat, was watching the exchange with the alert attention of someone who had already decided to remember everything she was seeing. Adrienne turned back to Marissa. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor, please." "She's already been called." "You'll need to wait." Adrienne did not move from the window. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture or sigh or roll her eyes. She simply stayed exactly where she was standing, portfolio under her arm, hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, and waited. She had learned this stillness a long time ago. She had learned it watching her mother handle a doctor who didn't believe her father's symptoms were real. She had learned it watching her grandmother handle a landlord who tried to raise the rent on a verbal lease. She had learned it in her own first job interview, when a partner at a Manhattan firm had asked her, with a smile, whether she was sure she could handle the pace of corporate work. The stillness wasn't passivity. It was the exact opposite. It was the controlled, focused presence of a person who had decided, very early in life, that she would never give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her unravel. Marissa, for her part, was typing again, slowly, with unnecessary precision. She glanced up at Adrienne every few seconds, then back at her screen, performing the appearance of work without actually doing any. The teller next to her, a young man named Devin who had been at the branch for 8 months, was watching the exchange out of the corner of his eye while he served his own customer. Something about it was making him uncomfortable. He couldn't have explained exactly what. He just knew, in the way that people sometimes know things without being able to name them, that something was wrong with what was happening at the next window. He finished his transaction, smiled at his customer, handed back her receipt. Then he turned slightly toward Marissa and said quietly, "Hey, I can help her if you're tied up." Marissa didn't look at him. "I've got it, Devin." Her voice was flat. "Manager's coming." Devin held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, then turned back to his window and waved the next customer forward. He didn't push it. He should have. He would think about that later for a long time. 3 minutes passed. Then 4. The footsteps that crossed the marble lobby at exactly 9:59 a.m. belonged to a woman named Patricia Ellsworth. She was 58 years old, the branch operations manager, and had been with Sterling National Bank for 22 years. She wore a navy skirt suit, low pumps, and a string of pearls that her husband had given her on their 25th wedding anniversary. She had the bearing of a woman who had spent 2 decades earning the respect of a male-dominated banking floor and had no intention of letting any of that respect slip on her watch. She walked up to Marissa's window with the brisk efficiency of someone who expected to resolve this in under 2 minutes and return to her desk before her 10:15 conference call. She stopped beside Marissa, glanced at Adrian. The same quick assessment Marissa had made earlier moved across her face in a slightly more refined form. Patricia was better at hiding it, but it was there. "What seems to be the problem?" "She's requesting a $12,000 cash withdrawal," Marissa said. "Something doesn't look right. The account information doesn't match what I'm seeing in front of me." Patricia turned to Adrian. The smile she gave was the kind of smile professional women learn to deploy in difficult situations. Warm enough to seem civil, cool enough to communicate authority. "Ma'am, I'm Patricia Ellsworth, the operations manager. Can I ask for your identification, please?" Adrian reached into her portfolio. She removed her driver's license. Then, because she had been doing this long enough to anticipate what was coming next, she also removed her passport. She placed both on the counter. Patricia picked up the driver's license first, examined it, turned it over, examined it again, set it down, picked up the passport, did the same. She looked at Adrian. "Ms. Carter, do you have any additional documentation? A utility bill, perhaps, something with a recent address?" "Both of those documents show my current address. The address is on file with the bank." "Yes, but for transactions of this size, we typically require additional verification." "It's our policy." "Is it the policy for all customers or just for some?" Patricia's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. The question had landed exactly where Adrian intended it to land. Not as an accusation, not as a challenge, just as a question, asked in a calm voice, with the patient curiosity of someone who already knew the answer but wanted to hear it spoken out loud. Patricia did not give her the satisfaction of an answer. Instead, she straightened her shoulders slightly and said, in the practiced cadence of someone reciting from a manual she had written portions of herself, "Our verification procedures are determined on a case-by-case basis depending on multiple factors. I don't have the authority to discuss those factors in detail with a customer." "Then who does?" "If you'd like to file a formal complaint, you're welcome to do so. There's a form available at the customer service desk." Adrian nodded slowly. "I see. And while I'm filing that form, will my withdrawal be processed?" "Not until we complete verification. And verification consists of additional documentation, which I've provided." "Additional documentation beyond what you've provided." The circular nature of the conversation was deliberate. Adrian recognized it immediately. It was the verbal equivalent of being held at a turnstile while everyone else was waved through, dressed up in the language of policy and procedure so that no individual statement could be challenged as discriminatory on its own. Each sentence was technically defensible. Together, they formed a wall. Patricia knew exactly what she was doing. So did Marissa. They had done it before in slightly different forms with slightly different customers, and they had never once been called to account for it. But this morning was going to be different, and the woman they were stonewalling was about to make sure of it. Adrian placed her hands flat on the counter, portfolio between them. She took one long, even breath. Then she said, in a voice that was not loud but carried in a way that loud voices never do, "I'd like to ask a question. and I'd like you both to think carefully before you answer. Have you, in the last 30 days, requested additional documentation beyond a single government-issued ID from any customer making a cash withdrawal of $12,000 or less at this branch? The question hung in the air. Patricia's smile, already thin, became thinner. Marissa looked at Patricia. Patricia did not look at Marissa. She looked at Adrian. Ms. Carter, I'm not going to discuss other customers' transactions. That's not what I asked. I asked whether you've required additional documentation in the last 30 days, yes or no. I'm not obligated to answer that question. You're not obligated to, but your transaction records are subject to internal audit, and those records will answer the question whether you do or not. Something shifted in Patricia's face. Just for a moment, the faintest flicker of recognition, not of who Adrian was, she still had no idea, but of the fact that this customer was not the kind of customer who could be talked in circles until she gave up and left. This customer knew things. This customer was using specific language. This customer had said the word audit without raising her voice or making it sound like a threat, and somehow that had made it sound more like a threat than any shouting could have. Patricia recovered quickly. She had not been operations manager for 14 years by panicking. Ms. Carter, I'd like to invite you to step into my office so we can discuss this privately. I'd prefer to stay here. It would be more comfortable. I'm perfectly comfortable. I'd like my withdrawal processed at this window, which is a service Sterling National Bank advertises and which I am entitled to as an account holder. Ms. Carter, I'm not going to argue with you in the lobby. I'm not arguing, I'm asking for service. The older woman in the tweed coat, still standing in line behind Adrian, made a small sound. Not quite a cough, not quite a word, just a sound. The sound of a person who had been listening carefully and had reached a private conclusion. She did not look up. She did not interject, but she shifted her weight slightly and angled her body so that she could see both Patricia and Adrian clearly. And from across the lobby, near the row of consultation desks, a young man in a dark suit had also begun to pay very close attention. His name was Aaron Reyes. He was 28 years old, 2 weeks into his first job at Sterling National Bank, and he had been assigned to the Madison Avenue branch as part of a rotational training program for the bank's commercial lending division. He had a master's degree from NYU, a mountain of student debt, and a quiet determination to keep his head down for at least 6 months before he started raising his hand for anything. He had been pretending to organize a stack of folders on his desk for the last 4 minutes, while every nerve in his body told him that something deeply wrong was unfolding 20 feet away. He had recognized Adrian the moment she walked in. He had spent the previous night reading every article he could find about the new ownership structure of the bank, because that was the kind of thing a 28-year-old with a master's degree did when his entire professional future was suddenly attached to a name he had never heard before. He had stared at Adrian Carter's photograph for a full minute on the company website at 11:47 the previous night. And now she was standing in his lobby being refused service, and nobody in the building had any idea who she was except him. He didn't move. Not yet. He told himself very quickly that there had to be a reason, that maybe she was here intentionally, that maybe this was some kind of audit, some kind of test, that getting involved would only make things worse. He told himself all of this in the space of about 8 seconds, and then he stopped telling himself anything because Patricia Ellsworth had just said something that made his stomach drop. Ms. Carter, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the window. If you refuse, I'll need to call security. Aaron's hand stopped moving over the folders. Adrian did not respond immediately. She took another slow breath. She looked at Patricia, then at Marissa, then briefly past them at the closed door behind the teller line that led to the back offices. Then she said very quietly, "Please call them. I'd like to have a clear record of what happens next." Patricia hesitated. The response was not the one she had expected. Customers in this position almost always either escalated or backed down. They did not invite security. They did not stand calmly at the counter and ask to be documented. The hesitation lasted less than a second, but it lasted long enough for Marissa to glance at Patricia with a flicker of uncertainty for the first time that morning. Patricia recovered. She picked up the phone on Marissa's station. She spoke briefly. She set it down. "Security is on the way." Adrian nodded. She did not move. Across the lobby, the older woman in the tweed coat had reached into her own handbag and quietly removed her phone. She was not making a show of it. She was simply holding it loosely at her side, screen up, the camera already opened. The man who had been scrolling on his phone earlier had stopped scrolling. He was now watching openly, with the slack-jawed attention of someone who had realized he was witnessing something more interesting than anything on his screen. Aaron Reyes stood up from his desk. He did not know what he was going to do. He just knew that if he stayed seated for another 30 seconds and Adrian Carter was escorted out of the lobby of the bank she now effectively owned, he was going to regret it for the rest of his career. He started walking toward the teller line, slowly, without urgency, trying to look like he was simply heading to the back office for a routine matter. He had taken exactly 4 steps when the security officer arrived. The officer's name was Howard Mills. He was 61 years old, a retired NYPD sergeant, and had been working security at the Madison branch for 9 years. He had a reputation among the staff as fair and unflappable, the kind of man who could de-escalate a shouting drunk customer without ever raising his own voice. He was generally well-liked. He was also, on this particular morning, about to make the biggest mistake of his post-retirement career. He approached Adrian with his hands held loosely at his sides, his expression carefully neutral. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me." Adrian looked at Howard. She did not turn her body. She did not raise her hands. She did not do anything that could later be misinterpreted in a security camera replay. She simply looked at him with the same calm she had maintained for the last 16 minutes and said, "I'd like to know on what grounds." Howard had answered this question many times in his career. He had answered it as a police sergeant. He had answered it as a security officer. He had a script for it that he had developed over 40 years of working in tense rooms with frightened or angry people. The script started with deflection and ended, when necessary, with the gentle but unmistakable application of authority. He used the opening line of the script now. "Ma'am, the staff has asked me to escort you out. I'd appreciate your cooperation. I appreciate that the staff has asked you to escort me out. I'm asking on what grounds. I haven't raised my voice, I haven't threatened anyone, and I haven't refused any reasonable request. I've asked for service and for an explanation, both of which I'm entitled to as an account holder." Howard glanced at Patricia. Patricia gave him a small nod. The nod meant, in the wordless language they had developed over 9 years of working together, "Trust me, this is necessary." Howard had trusted Patricia many times over those 9 years. He trusted her now. He took a step closer to Adrian, not aggressive, just close enough to be felt. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask one more time and then I'm going to have to insist." Adrian did not step back. She did not flinch. She said very evenly, "Officer Mills, I'd like you to think very carefully about what happens next. I'm a customer. I've broken no rule. I've asked for service that has been denied without cause. I'm not going to be escorted out of this building because 2 employees decided on site that I didn't belong here." She had used his name. Howard's eyes flicked down to his name tag and back up to her face. He had not introduced himself. The use of his name was a small thing, but it landed with a small jolt of recognition. This was not a confused customer. This was not a person who could be hustled out quickly and forgotten about. This was someone who was tracking every detail and who was making sure Howard knew she was tracking it. He hesitated. The hesitation lasted about 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, 3 things happened in different parts of the lobby. The older woman in the tweed coat lifted her phone the rest of the way and pressed record. The man who had been scrolling earlier muttered something under his breath that sounded a lot like "oh no." And Aaron Reyes, 2-week employee with a master's degree and a mountain of debt, walked up to the teller line and said, in a voice that came out steadier than he expected, "Patricia, can I speak with you for a moment?" Patricia turned her head sharply. She had not heard him approach. The interruption visibly annoyed her. Aaron, I'm in the middle of something. Whatever it is can wait. I don't think it can. Aaron. Her voice was the voice she used for subordinates who needed to be reminded of their place. Go back to your desk. We'll talk later. Aaron did not go back to his desk. He took a step closer to the counter, lowered his voice, and said something that nobody else in the lobby could hear. He said it in 3 short sentences. Patricia's face did not change for the first sentence. It changed slightly for the second. By the third sentence, the color had drained from her cheeks so completely that Marissa, watching from her station, actually leaned forward involuntarily because she thought Patricia was about to faint. Patricia stood very still. She did not look at Adrian. She did not look at Marissa. She did not look at Howard, who was still standing close to Adrian with his hand half raised, waiting for a signal that was no longer going to come. She looked instead at Aaron with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and dawning horror. Then she said, in a voice that came out much smaller than she intended, "Are you sure?" Aaron nodded once. "I read the press release at 6 this morning. Her photo is on the company website. It's her." Patricia turned very slowly to face Adrian. The professional polish she had maintained for the last 16 minutes did not so much crack as evaporate. Her shoulders, held square and confident a moment ago, dropped half an inch. Her hand, which had been resting on the edge of the counter with the casual authority of a manager in her own domain, twitched and then closed into a small, involuntary fist. She opened her mouth. She closed it again. The words she had been about to say, whatever they were going to be, no longer fit the situation that had just been described to her in 3 short sentences by a man who had been employed at the bank for less than 14 days. Howard, watching all of this from 2 feet away, picked up on the shift immediately. 40 years of reading rooms told him exactly what was happening without him needing to know the specifics. He took a step back from Adrian. A small step. But the step was visible. Adrian noticed it. So did the older woman in the tweed coat who had her phone still recording and had just captured the entire silent collapse of Patricia's authority in real time. Adrian did not speak. She did not need to. She simply waited. She had learned over the course of a 30-year career that there were moments when silence did more work than words ever could. This was one of them. The lobby, which had been quiet for the last several minutes in the held-breath way of a room watching something unpleasant unfold, now went completely silent. The soft music that had been playing from the overhead speakers seemed to fade, although nobody had touched the volume. The phone on Marissa's station, which had rung once during the exchange and been ignored, was no longer ringing. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to have dropped to a register that was easier to ignore. Every person in the room was waiting to see what would happen next. Patricia found her voice. It came out unsteady. "Ms. Carter, I think there may have been a misunderstanding." "There hasn't been a misunderstanding." Adrian's voice was the same calm, level voice it had been for the entire interaction. She had not adjusted it now that the balance of power had shifted. She would not adjust it. That was the entire point. "I came into this branch as a customer. I requested a standard service. I was denied that service without cause, asked for documentation that was not required of other customers, threatened with removal by security, and treated, from the moment I stepped up to that window, as someone who didn't belong in this building. There has been no misunderstanding. There has been a very clear sequence of decisions made by your employees and now by you that I would like to address in detail, but not here. Not in front of the line. Let's go to your office." Patricia nodded. She nodded several times, in fact, in the slightly disconnected way of a person whose body was responding faster than her brain. "Yes, yes, of course. Right this way." She turned to lead Adrian toward the back office. She did not look at Marissa. She did not look at Howard. She did not look at any of the customers in the lobby, several of whom were now openly staring. Adrian did not follow her immediately. She turned instead to Marissa. Marissa, who had been very still for the last several seconds, swallowed audibly. She had not yet been told what Aaron Reyes had said to Patricia. She did not know who Adrian was. But she had watched her manager's face drain of color, and she had watched the security officer step back. and she had watched the new hire from the commercial lending desk deliver 3 sentences that had changed the temperature of the entire room. Whatever was happening, Marissa understood with sudden clarity that it was not going to be good for her. Adrian looked at her, did not glare, did not smirk, did not perform anger or triumph. Just looked at her with the same steady attention she had used for the entire interaction. Then she said very quietly, "What's your name?" Marissa's mouth was dry. Marissa Whitfield. Marissa, I'd like you to come with us, please. This conversation involves you as well." Marissa's hands began to tremble. Marissa stepped out from behind the counter on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The walk to Patricia's office was the longest 50 feet of her career. She passed Devin, who would not look at her. She passed 2 customers at the consultation desks, who openly turned in their seats to watch her go. She passed the woman in the tweed coat, who had finally lowered her phone but had not stopped recording, the screen still showing a steady stream of video being captured from her hip. The office was small, lined with dark wood paneling and a single window that looked out onto the side street. Patricia gestured to the 2 chairs in front of her desk. Adrian did not sit. Marissa did not know whether to sit or stand, and so she did neither, hovering awkwardly in the doorway until Adrian, without turning around, said quietly, "Close the door, please." Marissa closed the door. The latch clicked into place with a sound that seemed much louder than it should have been. Adrian placed her portfolio on the corner of Patricia's desk. She unzipped it slowly and removed 3 documents. The first was her account statement, printed the night before, showing a personal account balance of just over $4 million and a series of routine transactions going back several years. The second was the printed press release that had gone out at 6 that morning, with her name and title clearly visible in the 3rd paragraph. The third was the signed acquisition agreement, 12 pages long, with her signature on the final page beside the corporate seal of Meridian Strategic Holdings. She laid each document on the desk in order. She did not speak while she did it. Patricia watched the documents accumulate with the still, paralyzed attention of a person watching evidence being arranged against her in real time. Marissa, who could see the desk over Patricia's shoulder, made a small sound when she saw the press release. It was not a word. It was the involuntary noise a person makes when their mind catches up to a reality their eyes have been refusing to accept for the last 60 seconds. Adrian sat down in one of the chairs. She gestured to the other one. "Please, both of you, sit." Patricia sat. Marissa sat. Adrian folded her hands in her lap. "My name is Adrian Carter. I am the founder and CEO of Meridian Strategic Holdings. 3 weeks ago, my firm completed the acquisition of this bank's parent company. The press release went out at 6 o'clock this morning. My photograph has been on the company website since 7:30. I came into this branch this morning because I had a personal errand to run before my first official board meeting at noon. I did not announce my visit. I did not bring an entourage. I came in as a customer because I wanted, before I sat down with the board, to understand what kind of customer experience this branch was providing on an ordinary Tuesday morning to an ordinary person who did not appear to be important." She paused. The pause was deliberate. "Now I know." Patricia opened her mouth to speak. Adrian raised one hand just slightly, and Patricia closed it again. "I'm not finished. I'd like to walk through what happened this morning in detail because I want both of you to hear it back from me before this conversation continues." She began to recount the interaction, calmly, precisely. From the moment she stepped up to Marissa's window to the moment Howard Mills had been called over. She did not embellish. She did not add adjectives. She simply described what had happened in order, with the kind of detail that made it clear she had been mentally cataloging every word and every gesture from the very beginning. When she got to the part about Marissa saying the account information didn't match the customer standing in front of her, Marissa's eyes filled with tears. Adrian did not stop. She kept going. When she got to the part about Patricia threatening to call security, Patricia closed her eyes for a long moment and did not open them again until Adrian had moved past it. When Adrian finished, the office was very quiet. Patricia's hands were folded so tightly on her desk that her knuckles had gone white. "Here's what's going to happen now," Adrian said. "I am going to leave this office. I am going to walk back out to the teller line. I am going to make the withdrawal I came here to make, which is $12,000 in cash from my personal account, a transaction I am entitled to without explanation, without justification, and without any documentation beyond what is legally required. After I leave this branch, I am going to spend the rest of today preparing for my noon meeting with the board. Tomorrow morning, I am going to request a full audit of this branch's transaction records going back 24 months, with specific attention to verification procedures and how they have been applied across different customer demographics. That audit will be conducted by an independent firm and reviewed by both internal compliance and external counsel. I'm also going to request the security footage from this morning, which I expect to be preserved and provided to me intact by end of business today." She looked at Patricia. "Do you understand?" Patricia nodded. She did not trust her voice. "What happens to the two of you," Adrian continued, "will not be decided by me personally. It will be decided through the appropriate internal processes, governed by HR policy, employment law, and the findings of the audit. I will not be involved in those decisions, because that would be inappropriate. What I will say is this. The video that was recorded by the woman in the tweed coat standing in line behind me is already in the hands of someone who will know exactly what to do with it. I do not control whether that video becomes public. I am not going to ask her to suppress it. What happens to your reputations, both professionally and personally, will be a consequence of your own choices this morning, not of any action taken by me." She stood up. She picked up her portfolio. She left the documents on the desk. "I expect those returned to my office by courier this afternoon." She walked out of the office without looking back. The lobby was waiting for her. Every face turned. Howard Mills stood by the entrance with his hands at his sides and an expression on his face that he would later describe to his wife as the worst moment of his entire career. He stepped aside as Adrian approached. She paused in front of him. "Officer Mills." Her voice was quiet. "You were given bad information by your colleagues. I understand that. What I'd like you to think about is the question you asked yourself, or didn't ask, before you stepped toward me. That's the question that matters. Not for me, for the next person." Howard nodded. He could not speak. Adrian walked to Devon's window. Devon, who had been frozen at his station for the last several minutes, snapped to attention. "Ms. Carter, how can I help you? $12,000 in cash, please, from my personal account." Devon's hands moved across the keyboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this transaction 1,000 times. 3 minutes later, Adrian walked out of Sterling National Bank with a white envelope tucked into her portfolio and the morning sun on her face. The video went viral at 4:47 that afternoon. 12 million views in 72 hours. The hashtag trended for 6 days. The internal audit lasted 9 weeks and resulted in the termination of 4 employees and a complete restructuring of the branch's verification procedures. Patricia Ellsworth was offered a severance package and declined to comment in any interview she was subsequently asked to give. Marissa Whitfield never worked in banking again. Aaron Reyes was promoted twice within his first 18 months and now leads a community lending initiative that Adrian personally funds through Meridian Strategic Holdings. The woman in the tweed coat, whose name was Alina Briggs, received a handwritten thank you note from Adrian and a donation in her name to the literacy nonprofit she had been volunteering at for the past 20 years. The $12,000 went, as it did every quarter, to a scholarship fund in Baltimore for first-generation college students from neighborhoods like the one Adrian had grown up in. So here's my question for you. Not about Adrian, about the lobby. About the people who saw it and said nothing until the very end. What would you have done? Drop your honest answer in the comments. Like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.